Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Deleted Scenes from Sunday's Sermon. Today's topic, the obedience that comes from faith. It's one of my favorite phrases in the entire Bible, and you find it right at the end of Romans chapter 1, verse 5. This is what it says: the obedience that comes from faith. Here the Apostle Paul was describing to the believers in Rome the transformation that Jesus brings into our lives. And he uses the phrase, the obedience that comes from faith. What a beautiful phrase. What a beautiful way to describe how we do and why we do the things that we do. Now, this is important because as I reflect on this, our obedience can come from different places. I want to share with you two places that our obedience can come from. And then I want to show you the place where our obedience should come from. Let's start with the first one. There's an obedience that comes from fear. In other words, we do the things that we do because we're afraid of what God's going to do to us if we don't do them. Now, don't get me wrong. The Bible does teach us in the book of Proverbs that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. But there's a kind of fear that actually is rooted in ignorance, of not knowing the true and living God. The true and living God is a God who has revealed himself as a God who is holy and also as a God who is loving and forgiving through the work of Jesus Christ. But there is an obedience that comes from fear. Number two, there's also an obedience that comes from facts. In other words, I do what I do because it makes sense. It's reasonable. It's rational. That's why I believe and obey in God's word. Now, don't get me wrong. If we were to both get on a plane and fly over to Jerusalem, if we walked around town, we would discover that there's real evidence that Jesus Christ was a real person who walked on this earth, that Jesus Christ died on the cross. There's evidence of that. And we could go to the tomb of Jesus and we would discover that the tomb of Jesus is empty. That's the truth. There's no denying that. There's a faith that comes from facts. But what's the problem with that? What happens when God calls us to do things and to believe things that actually don't really seem to make sense to us at all? That's the case of what happened to Peter in Luke chapter 5. After Jesus was done preaching the gospel to the crowd, he turned to Peter and he told him and instructed him, let's put your boat out into the deep and let's go fishing. You see, Peter, from his perspective, that didn't make sense. Well, let Peter say what he said to Jesus. In Luke chapter 5, verse 5, the first part of his response was, Simon answered, Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. Jesus was asking Peter to do something that didn't make sense. He had just spent the entire night out there with Andrew and James and John, and they had not caught a single thing on their deep sea fishing expedition. Why would they go back out there and continue to fish when the fish weren't biting that day? So it wasn't reasonable. It wasn't rational. What Jesus was asking him to do didn't make sense. But now let me show you Peter's complete response to Jesus. Let's look at it again. Luke chapter 5, verse 5. Simon answered, Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets. And what does the Bible tell us happened next? After they let down that net, it began to break. The boat they were in began to sink because of the great quantity of fish they caught that day. You see, the obedience of Peter was not an obedience that comes from fear, and it wasn't an obedience that comes from facts. It was an obedience that comes from faith. The request to let down his nets didn't make sense to Peter. But that's not what was important in that moment. What was important in that moment is that it made sense to Jesus Christ, and that this was part of Jesus' plan for Peter's life. You see, the obedience that comes from faith is rooted and grounded in the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. The obedience that comes from faith says the following: I walk by faith and not by sight. Thank you for tuning in, and may God richly bless you.